telling you they can't get in here.
Night of the Living Dead is often regarded as one of the greatest horror or zombie films of all time, but personally, I would go as far to say it's one of the greatest films of all time. It's one of my personal favorite films. It's one of the only films I've deemed worthy enough to own a Criterion edition of. I also have a signed poster from John Russo. A friend gave this to me knowing my love for the film. And my love for this film isn't like most others. I love this film with the majority of my heart, not even taking into account my love for the film. The film itself, an extremely groundbreaking film, in more than one way, might I add. To avoid talking about politics for a little bit, we're going to talk about some behind-the-scenes technical and story stuff. Behind the scenes, this wasn't a big production by any means. The majority of the people working on the film were friends and family to those in the movie. When you look at who was in it, it was mostly local actors at the time, and the film was shot in Evans City, PA, so most of the actor and actresses were either from PA or a surrounding state. The film was also Romero's film debut, and he did most of the work himself. He didn't just direct and co-write with John Russo. Romero was also responsible for the photography and the editing. When people ask me who are some of my inspirations when it comes to filmmaking, Romero is always near the top of the list. The man did it all. Now, before he even became a filmmaker, Romero did some commercial work, and through that he learned how to master guerrilla filmmaking, making the most out of what he had. And what he had was a mere $114,000, which even for 1968 wasn't a lot of money to make a film with. So how did a relatively unknown director take an out there idea like zombies and make one of the greatest films of all time? Now, I don't know if anyone has ever heard this before, but people in the 1960s were a little sensitive when it came to horror films. In fact, Night of the Living Dead was seen as controversial and garnered, let's just call them negative to be nice, reviews. Like I said, the film came out in 1968, just before the MPAA would introduce a rating system, so there wasn't really a warning for this film. However, despite the negative press and the controversy, the film managed to pull in $30 million, which is insane to think about when you realize this film was made for next to nothing, and it wasn't made by any big Hollywood names. Over the years, the film would gain quite a cult following, and upon further review, it became a critical success. I do want to note that the film doesn't actually have a rating. If I were to rate it from today's standards, the film is probably a strong PG-13, but in 1968, it probably would have been an R or maybe an NC-17, whichever came first. Now, like I said, the film grew quite a cult following, such a following that George A. Romero was able to put out a number of sequels. This includes Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, and Survival of the Dead. Dawn and Day were probably the most successful when it comes to the sequels, but Land actually has some interesting ideas about continuing the stories of the zombies' evolution in the world Romero created. Diary and Survival are just bad, though. Don't watch those. So if you made it this far into the video, I'm just going to assume you're either invested or you just like hearing me talk. If it's the latter, I suggest you find professional help, but I know I talked about the details behind the scenes and after its release, but I haven't said what the film is actually about. So believe it or not, the film's title is actually quite literal. It's nighttime and there's the living dead. There you go, that's the movie. I'm kidding, kind of. More specifically, the film is about a group of survivors hiding out in a farmhouse in PA during a zombie apocalypse. However, we quickly learn that the survivors don't just have to survive zombies, but they need to learn to survive each other. Yeah, that's kind of a common trope with these movies, but at the time, it had never been done, so I cut the movie some slack, given that it's the first one. I don't want to get too much into spoilers, because if you haven't seen it, you really should, and if you have, I don't want to tell you something you already know. I know I said earlier that I wouldn't get political, and I'm trying not to be, but the film was actually very influential in ways that weren't just on and off screen. The film stars Duane Jones as Ben. Now, Duane Jones hadn't done much prior to Night of the Living Dead, but his role in the film marked the first time an African-American man was cast as the star or hero of a horror film. This was seen as a big deal at the time, and a huge step in good representation for African-Americans in film, but Romero himself claimed that Jones was hired because he was the best actor for the role, and I would agree, Jones is fantastic in this. So I know what you're thinking. I click on this video about why Night of the Living Dead is a masterpiece, and all I've had is a YouTube idiot ramble at me. Well, let me tell you why I think it's a masterpiece. It's just a great movie. Listen, I can sit here and lecture you about how the film was made for no money, it was a bare bones production, and all that shit, but none of that matters. If the film itself isn't great, and thankfully this film is, the film, as I said, is simple. It's a group of survivors stuck in a farmhouse trying to survive zombies. No more, no less. The film isn't trying to lecture you about how woke it is, because Dwayne Jones is the lead. It's just a story of survival. Human instinct, if you will. It deals with themes of fear as well, and what someone will do in the name of fear to try and stop it. I've heard people say in the past that calling a film simple is an insult, but I don't agree. This film is very simple, and it excels in telling a meaningful story nonetheless. This film proves that you don't need big action sequences and CGI, thousands of zombies to create tension for the survivors. A good story goes a long way, and this film just proves that if the story is good enough, it doesn't matter the production, or how big the budget was, or how big the crew was, or anything like that. If the passion is there, it'll show. This film is one of the greatest films ever made, and it's easily a 10 out of 10. For those wondering, no, I haven't seen the remake.